Hi everyone, this is Nina with 3 Day Startup. Welcome to our installment of a Workalong, and today we're with Luis Rincon of Wearables.com, a database for wearable tech. So Luis will give his talk, and afterwards there'll be a short. To participate in the Q&A, please go to the landing page, and you'll see a link to YouTube. And when you click that link, you can just comment on the bottom like you would with a normal YouTube video. So without further ado, here is Louise. Hi everyone, this is Nina with 3 Day Startup. Welcome to our installment of a Workalong.
Okay, guys. So first of all, welcome to the presentation. I'm going to put us in present mode here. Hopefully you guys have no issues with the presentation. So this talk is around business ethics and early a little bit about myself. So who am I? My name is Luis Rincon. As Nina mentioned, I'm co-founder and CEO of Wearables.com. We are a site specializing in wearable technology, specifically interactions with available products as on the industry, so product industry news, stuff like that. I'm actually a former product manager of e-commerce at a company here in town in Austin called buildasign.com. You guys can see all my school stuff on there. That's all boring old school stuff. I'm also a former associate and principal with Texas Venture Labs while at UT, and I've been a 3DS volunteer and friend since 2011. So let's talk about business ethics in startups and why I chose to talk about this. So first of all, I wanted to choose a subject matter that I was not an expert in.
Okay, sorry.
Our apologies, guys. I guess we're having some sort of technical difficulties here.
And you should be good.
Okay, so going back to why business ethics and startups. So I wanted to choose a subject that I was not an expert in, really just for the challenge of it, but I also wanted to select a subject matter that I feel could apply broadly to everyone in the early stage company environment, regardless of role, industry, business model, geographic location. I was actually asked previously to talk about business ethics in early stage companies, and I was shocked by this specifically on ethics as applied to the early stage company environment. This was really surprising to me given the nature of investment in the space, which has a lot of compliance regulations, and the explosion of interest and growth and just startup culture over the last 10 to 15 years. It can be a very vague area. My goal with this talk is to highlight some of the best resources I found on the subject, talk about my findings there, and hopefully to create a starting point for those involved in the early stage company environment to have a discussion with their network and organizations about how it applies to them. So in this presentation, it's really divided into three areas. The first are founder disputes, and this really talks about common issues amongst co-founders, and then investor relations, and sometimes some scenarios where ethical dilemmas can appear. And then the last is I've asked entrepreneurs, investors, business ethics experts around the subject, and I've taken some highlights of my conversations with those people, and I've implemented them in the third section about how to make ethics a focus. So let's start with business ethics, a definition of it, and okay, so apparently there's an issue with the slides pulling up, but I guess I am on video here. You sure you don't want to just show the slide deck here?
Um, can you, can you access it?
So hopefully now you guys can actually view the slides here. Sorry again, I guess we're having some more technical difficulties. I think we've confirmed here that we're on the slides now. Okay. So in terms of founder disputes, we'll cover a handful of who gets what, who gets to decide, and you're not pitching in enough. So the main disputes around co-founders I found through my research circulate around monetary issues, power issues, control disputes, and personality disputes, and that can include, the work ethic and work style issues. Given the nature of a startup, to use a definition from Steve Blank here, a startup's a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. It's not surprising that there's issue with the earliest and I guess the foremost employees in a startup. So let's just start with the first one of who gets what. And this conflict is fairly common. These are actually great points that I got from a post by Dharmesh Shah. And anything really that impacts the amount of money that investors in the business as well as employees generate, there's area for conflict. Company, who gets much, why, what happens if somebody leaves. The good news about these sort of economic conflicts is that the conflict itself is typically rational. There can be a predetermined amount that's set. Hopefully helps to guide conversation around these issues. Everybody wants to be treated fairly, so there might be a natural conflict of interest here. If one person gets more shares and somebody else has to get less. Most conflicts in this category can actually be resolved through discussion with peers, as well as negotiation. And typically, if you've done the right legal work, you also have outside intervention that you can reach out to. In terms of who gets to decide, so typically co-founders should, or in the most optimal circumstances, are well matched if they have different. And there might be some overlap, but traditionally you want somebody who has a resident expert in one area, whereas another co-founder is a resident expert in another area. And if there's a who gets to decide conflict, the easiest thing to do is just to defer to areas of expertise. So that's a big reason that we'll get into later about how you need to be careful about choosing your co-founder, but you also need to be respectful of their knowledge base as well. There's sometimes areas where either lack of experience or actual experience overlaps. And a great example that's brought up by Shah is a lot of co-founders are first-time fundraisers because they're first-time entrepreneurs, so there's a lot of conflict around that. The main ethical concern here, or ethical advice from what I've found, is just have the conversations early on about which areas resident decider in. If there is a hierarchy within the startup, that also has to be respected. And in terms of the last one, you're not pitching in enough. This really speaks to the differences in work ethics and work styles. This one can be a little bit more fluid, as it can vary per project. Somebody might not be contributing a lot on one project, but it must also be looked at as the sum of all work as well. Everything that's going on in a startup isn't traditionally just one project, and what may not appear like a lot of pitching in one area is actually due to overworking in certain areas. In terms of going back to the who gets to decide, In these instances, the work a lot of times can be outside of the scope of expertise that I mentioned earlier of the agitated co-founder skill set. Having a good operating agreement in place in terms of what level of commitment is expected, and going back to those documents and then having a 360 conversation around it is typically the best way to handle it. The one thing that I found with founder disputes in all my research was you should just be very careful and objective up front when choosing a co-founder. Myself at Workalong, there's 3 of us co-founders, and I knew these guys very well. We'd worked together for over 3 years, and it's a very dynamic relationship, and it's very employer, a hire relationship, and you have to ask yourself, do you know them well? Have you worked with them or gone to school with them? Do you each bring a specific and perhaps a different value or skill set to the company? And don't just jump into the co-founder relationship with someone who's available or seems good or is your friend or likes your idea or your product. You have to evaluate past that. Perhaps most famously in founder disputes, I'm going to play a video here and I'll cut it off. If an ad happens to appear, I apologize. This is hosted on YouTube. Not a whole lot we can do here, but for those of you who've seen The Social Network, this is a great scene between 2 of the co-founders around itself. North Texas for Natural Gas apparently is advertising on YouTube. Here we go. Oh, sorry. So I was just told that the audio was not presented there, but again, another technical issue we're having here. I can just kind of play out that scene. What happens is the thinner guy of the 2, the one who's standing up, his name is Eduardo Severin. He was one of the original co-founders of Facebook, and obviously the guy sitting down we all know as Mark Zuckerberg here, the actor portraying Mark Zuckerberg. And essentially what happened was Mark Zuckerberg, along with the other co-founders of Facebook, issued new shares and caused a huge dilution to Eduardo's stake in the company. And for those of you unfamiliar with the term dilution, it's just issuing new stock or extra existing shares, less valuable traditionally. So in this case, there's a great ethical question that presents itself of issues around legal versus ethical behavior, and the ethical question here is, what would have been the ethical thing for Zuckerberg founders to do? And again, this is ethical, not legal, right? The best answer there is just having a transparent conversation around the issuance of new stock, especially before it happens. The effect it would have on existing ownership is drastic, and this is one of the most sensitive and complicated areas of the co-founder relationship. It is actually important to note, in the legal versus ethical behavior question, that Mark Zuckerberg is actually partially right from a legal perspective, that Eduardo did sign the documents knowing that the dilution was possible and could and would happen. However, in actuality, as many of us know, later sued Facebook for breach of fiduciary duty, and he walked away with about 4 or 5%, it's estimated, of the company, which, given Facebook's current market cap, is worth about 8 or 10 billion. So this is one of the most, I guess, scandalous examples of unethical behavior at the co-founder level. And The Social Network, obviously a very famous movie. I thought that would resonate with some of the viewers here. In terms of founder disputes, then, just to wrap up the conversation there, transparency is huge. There's a very intimate relationship and transparency in all operations, whether that be fundraising or actually running the business. That helps manifest trust and respect. Remember that you get into these relationships, starting a new venture with that specific person. Hopefully, if you did it objectively for a reason, somewhere at some point you found to draw on those attributes of that person to remember why you got into this with them for the first place. In terms of roles and expectations, this is meant more so in a conversation. Make sure that you guys, in terms of not really the legal side of things, this is more the handshake side of things. Let each other know what's expected up front, and revisit those roles and expectations as the organization and product culture evolves. It's also just a good idea to find a tiebreaker policy. Maybe it's the person with the most area expertise wins, or you guys get a third party come in, some sort of mediator. The last piece there is actually a recommendation more so on the operating and legal side. So for those of you unfamiliar with shareholder agreements, first you have the bylaws that typically set the rules and regulations of operating the business, but the shareholders agreement is typically a supplemental document that shareholders can use to create certain rights, and it's a lot more typical when there's a small amount of shareholders, and those small amount of shareholders are actually active in the operations, and you can set items up front like who gets how much equity and why, what happens if new investors come in, everyone's duties, their job descriptions, their hourly commitments, what happens if one of you wants to sell the company, raise capital, or end it, if one of you gets disabled or dies, even whether launching other startups outside of your existing startups is okay. And legal agreements really I know that sometimes can be a hot button issue, but they can help to cement expectations. And also, if you hire the right legal counsel, you'll be bringing on an experienced and trustworthy third party who can often act as that mediator. So in the second portion of ethical issues that are common in the early stage company environment, this is actually something that I found a decent amount of writings on, and probably a case study called Ethics in Venture Capital by Ashish Nanda. It's available through the Harvard Business Review site. And really what this touches up on, as I have there on the slide, there's a variety of different investment vehicles or types of investments that an early stage company can take on. But this paper specifically brought up some really interesting points around ethical behavior as required in venture capital. So more so focusing on that last institutional type of investment. Let's talk about, within that investment scheme, there's a lot of opportunity for maintaining and perhaps even hiding certain information, and this can create an asymmetry that can be very detrimental to the investor and entrepreneur relationship, and there's certain opportunities for either to perhaps not act ethically. So on the entrepreneur side, entrepreneurs about the day-to-day operations of the firm. They can make representations or projections that are more likely to bring in investment that are actually true. Unfortunately, nowadays there's like this big reputational value associated with just raising large amounts of money, and some entrepreneurs see that in it as a success in itself. And so a lot of them are perhaps just gaming it to win, to get to this victory. And so investors are essentially faced with two problems, right? The entrepreneurs could be hiding information which incorrectly influences their decisions, or the entrepreneurs are hiding action, which can negatively affect the performance of the venture. There's definitely mechanisms in place to protect against this sort of unethical behavior, such as syndicating rounds. Really just means bringing on other investors, offering incentive compensation to the entrepreneurs. The most obvious or the most traditional being that setting up a vesting schedule for their equity, getting a seat on the board of directors, and appointing employees along with their investment. All of these are done nowadays. In terms of on the investment side, there's an entrepreneurial risk here in that investors can share any sort of information that you provide them during the pitch process with potential competitors or even investors of potential competitors. For those of us who have worked in the early stage environment, we know that sign an NDA early on in the process, and they're correct to do so. This would open them up to too much liability. However, that does raise a concern of there's a chance for unethical behavior for them then taking that information and using it to the detriment of that person, of the entrepreneur, right? There's also there's terms called venture starving or venture shelving, and really what this means is the entrepreneur discloses certain information that's valuable to the investor, perhaps outside of that investment, and the investor then artificially to investment to handicap that company, or they sort of starve that process in order to allow another company to raise quicker or more, or even for more strategic investors. Entrepreneurs actually typically have less mechanisms at their disposal to protect themselves here. The one thing that is definitely huge that does act as a shield for them is there's a huge reputational risk for investors to do any of these above-mentioned unethical items, and that can hurt their deal flow. It can hurt existing relationships, and luckily to say, most VCs don't actually participate in this sort of behavior. So in terms of the asymmetry of information, the takeaways that we found there were just ultimately transparency is needed on both sides of the table. Entrepreneurs must understand that not signing an NDA, at least not in the initial meetings, is part of their business. There is actually a strong reputational risk on both sides of the table, and both of these both advantage that. And in terms of actually getting in a business relationship with someone on the investment side, each side should do their homework beforehand. For entrepreneurs, we talked there's less mechanisms for protection, but references go a long way. Just ask previous investments of that investor what their thoughts are, what their experience was with them. And it's pretty indicative of what you can expect. So this third section, and perhaps my favorite, again, as I mentioned, throughout the entire process of this, I was shocked at the scarcity of resources available for this, for business ethics, especially in the early stage environment. So I talked to entrepreneurs, investors, and business ethics experts around the subject matter, and these next few slides are my largest takeaways from those conversations. And this was a great definition that Josh Pierce, who's a friend of mine and a entrepreneur and investor in his own right through Socratic Venture, presented, and I actually thought that it applied directly to different ways of viewing ethics. Again, as I mentioned, that it's a vague term, it's hard to define, but it's one of those things that when you see it, you'll know it. A great conversation I had was with a CEO here in town, Dustin Wells. He's the CEO and founder of a company called Headspring. I asked him specifically how they've gone about making ethics core to their product and to their company culture. And the one thing that he really harped on was transparency and establishing core values. They actually do this through what they call their core ideology stack. And it's a shared set of values and a shared purpose that they use as checkpoints throughout the development of their company. And transparency throughout all that it's used. They actually have a very liberal access to data policy, and all employees get access to the most important data. And he's actually mentioned how this has helped drive that. One question that I did ask Dustin that I found extremely interesting, I asked him, at what stage should an early stage company set or define their guiding principles? And really it came down to, once you're at the co-founder level, and definitely starting with once you start hiring, so either have the co-founders set this conversation or begin defining this. You don't want to wait too long and perhaps allow an organic culture to rise that goes against what you actually want to establish. And another great point by Dustin came around, remember the need to act ethically occurs both when you act but also when you react to somebody, especially when somebody has acted unethically to your company, which I found fascinating. Most of us think about unethical behavior as something that we do, not something that we do in reaction. Another great conversation I had was with Jonathan Spillman, who's a VP with a company here in town called Humble. Their company culture and ethics. Part of that conversation straight out the fact that when you know that everything you do is an open book, if you have this level of transparency, it typically leads to more honest and moral behavior. In terms of their product, Humble is really unique in that they actually have a market-leading social media analytics and behavioral data platform. So when you have a a product like that is at the forefront of ethical data collection and use, there's obviously many ways to exploit that consumer data that they collect, and they have a very strict policy around how they treat that data. And a great quote that I got from Jonathan was actually that great feelings come from having a strong correlation among internal behaviors and the product and services that you sell as the core of your business. Another conversation that I thought was fascinating, and I want to really end the conversation piece on this because it ends with an exercise that you can take. Peter Escher with Starbucks Coffee Company in Washington. He's also a former director with the MBA Oath, which if you are looking for a great resource around starting conversations of ethical behavior with your company, the MBA Oath is a fantastic place to start. It was actually the goal with the MBA Oath was creating a common language just to start the conversation. That's not the line that you see up there up top is not a quote from Peter. It's really something that I took away from my conversation with him. And applied to early stage companies. Early stage companies are by definition very volatile. You miss goals, you succeed, you pivot. All of these things are fairly common. You have to ask yourself, what is the common language that will help unify us as a team, as a startup? And that bottom quote is actually a really good exercise that you can use. The individual actually can use it to get the wheels turning on ethical behavior as applied to your company and your organization. It actually takes some more thought than you think, just outright of what's the purpose of my startup and what's the purpose for me being here. So some takeaways throughout all this. The one thing that came up the most in our conversations with entrepreneurs and investors was just transparency. It's always good to have something that you are shooting for, your purpose or goal that's not related to maximizing shareholder value. And the culture that you create is going to be indicative of the people at the top. So there has to be a leading from example. And there's not a shortage of models that you can learn from, both bad and good. So spend time learning those. There's a lot typically on the bad side, but there's also great companies to emulate. And most importantly, just have the conversation. Start with that exercise I provided in that last slide, and go from there. That's really what hopefully this webinar, if there's anything you take away, we just need to have. Lastly, I'd like to say thanks, first of all, to the entrepreneurs and investors who took time out of their busy schedule to talk to me about the subject matter. Definitely check out their companies and their sites. They're a fantastic source of information. And I also have included sources there that I've used if you want to check that out, as well as certain articles that I found that the authors to those articles. And I think we're going to see if there's any sort of questions available now. And again, apologies for the technical difficulties early on. Okay, so I think we are good. It doesn't appear that there are any questions. If you guys think of any as you go or as you watch this, just shoot me an email. Email is simple. It's luis@wearables.com. Thanks again for your time. Hopefully this helps you guys start the conversation internally about ethics and your startup. Take care.
All right. And we'll provide a link of his talk in PowerPoint on the landing page so you guys can look at it later. Thanks for joining us today and have a great weekend.